At the family party, the laughter and music should have blended into one of those harmless memories you replay years later. The smell of grilled food, the clinking of glasses, kids darting around the backyard with sparklers in their hands. But instead, there is one image burned into my mind so sharply that even now it makes my stomach twist. My little girl, standing frozen in the middle of the living room, her head completely shaved. Strands of her long hair scattered across the floor like something ripped away from her. For a split second, I couldn't breathe. My sister was leaning against the wall, grinning, as if she just pulled the funniest prank of the evening. "It's a joke," she said, her voice dripping with amusement while everyone else stared in stunned silence. But nothing about that moment felt like a joke. It felt like a declaration of war. And in that instant, I knew this night would change everything between us forever. I didn't scream. I didn't lunge at her. I didn't even bend down to scoop up the silky brown strands that only hours ago I had carefully brushed before tying a little bow in my daughter's hair. Instead, I stood there rooted to the spot because the weight of it all pressed down on me so heavily that I couldn't move. My daughter, barely 8 years old, had tears welling in her wide eyes, her tiny hands hovering near her bare scalp as if she couldn't quite process what had been done to her. She had begged me to let her wear her hair loose that day. She said it made her feel like a princess. And now here she was, stripped of it in the middle of a crowded room, treated like the butt of a cruel joke. My sister's laughter filled the silence, sharp and mocking, daring anyone to contradict her. "Relax, it'll grow back," she added, as though she had the right to dismiss my child's identity as temporary and replaceable. But I saw what no one else wanted to see. The humiliation, the shame settling into my daughter's tiny shoulders, the way she turned her face into my dress when I finally forced myself to move toward her. That's when something inside me hardened, because this wasn't the first time my sister had crossed a line. It was just the most visible one. I remembered the birthdays she had sabotaged with her sarcastic gifts, the vacations she had ruined with her constant need to be the center of attention, the way she had smirked when my mother took her side during every argument growing up. She had always needed to win, even if it meant crushing me. But this wasn't about me anymore. This was about my daughter, and I swore silently right then that my sister would never laugh at her expense again. When I was little, my sister and I were often dressed alike, two girls in matching dresses with identical ribbons tied into our hair, but no amount of fabric could hide the difference in how we were treated. She was the golden child, bold, loud, impossible to ignore, and every time she demanded attention, she got it. I was quieter, cautious, eager to please, and I learned early on that pleasing didn't matter. What mattered was spectacle. She could break a vase and call it an accident, and my mother would sigh and remind me to be more helpful instead of scolding her. She could stomp her feet and cry in the store, and I'd watch as our father caved, buying her what she wanted while I carried the grocery bags. It became a pattern so ingrained that by the time we were teenagers, she knew she could take what was mine simply because no one would stop her. My first boyfriend? She flirted with him in front of me, then whispered to my parents that I was being dramatic when I confronted her. My scholarship acceptance letter? She accidentally spilled juice over it, laughing when I screamed. And my mother told me not to hold grudges over little things. My life was a series of lessons in swallowing humiliation, taught by her hand and reinforced by parents who thought enabling her would keep the peace. When I finally married and had my daughter, I thought I had carved out a piece of the world she couldn't touch. But family ties are chains, and she always found ways to rattle them. She showed up uninvited to our holidays, joked about my daughter's weight, offered her candy she wasn't allowed to eat just to undermine me. Each time I bit my tongue because I didn't want to be accused of overreacting, of being the difficult one. But standing in that room, staring at my child with her shaved head and the pile of hair scattered like discarded evidence, I realized silence was complicity. Every time I swallowed my anger, I taught my sister that her cruelty had no cost. And now it was my daughter who had to bear the humiliation. I looked at my sister that night, her arms crossed, her lips curled into that satisfied grin, and I knew something had shifted. I wouldn't be the quiet one anymore. If she wanted a joke, I was about to deliver one. But mine would land like a hammer, and the punchline would be the end of her control over my family. The party itself blurred into fragments after that moment, though I remember every detail of the faces around me. The cousins who tried to keep sipping their drinks, eyes darting away so they wouldn't have to get involved. The aunts who shook their heads with pity but said nothing. There's silence as sharp as laughter. Even my parents. My own mother actually chuckled, putting a hand on my sister's arm as if she were an unruly child who had only spilled some punch, not stripped her granddaughter of her pride. "Oh, come on, it's hair," my mother said, as if that excused the betrayal. My daughter clung to me, her small body trembling, and all I could think was how she had begged me earlier to braid her hair with ribbons because she wanted to look beautiful for everyone. I carried her into the bathroom, avoiding the mirrors, and tried to comfort her while her bald head rested against my chest. She whispered, "Mommy, am I ugly now?" And my throat closed around the words I wanted to say. I promised her she was beautiful, that she was perfect, but inside me something snapped like a brittle branch, because this wasn't just cruelty, it was ownership. My sister wanted to prove that she could take from me whenever she wanted, even if what she took was my child's confidence. I walked back out into the living room with my daughter in my arms, and the laughter died down. Everyone watched me, waiting for the explosion. They expected me to scream, to cause a scene, to confirm the story they had been told for years, that I was the uptight, dramatic one, while my sister was just playful. Instead, I set my daughter down gently on the couch and told her to wait for me. Then I turned to my sister, my voice level, cold. "You think this is funny?" I asked. She smirked. "It's just a joke. Don't be so serious all the time." I nodded slowly, as if I'd finally understood something. And in a way, I had. She wanted me to play the role she'd scripted for me all my life, the outraged, humiliated one, the easy target. But this time, I decided to write the ending myself. I sat down across from her, folded my hands, and looked at her long enough that the smirk faltered. The room was so quiet I could hear the ice melting in the glasses. My revenge wouldn't come in a scream or a slap. It would come in silence, in strategy, in exposing her for exactly what she was. And for the first time, I saw fear flicker in her eyes. Because she realized she hadn't broken me, she had awakened me. I started by taking inventory, names, dates, witnesses, small things that add up to one unignorable truth. This wasn't a one-off prank. It was part of a pattern, and patterns can be documented. I photographed the hair on the floor. I saved the ribbon my daughter had worn that morning. I screenshot the text my sister had sent earlier that week. One line about teaching her a lesson that had seemed like gallows humor at the time, but now read like a confession. I quietly asked my niece, who'd been hovering by the punch bowl, what she had seen. She fidgeted, but told me she'd seen my sister pull a pair of clippers from a handbag and whisper to the older cousin to keep her distracted. I found the receipt. For those clippers in a little trash can near the patio the next morning, crumpled, half soaked with spilled lemonade. But the date matched the week before the party, and the store's imprint was clear. I made a list of people who'd laugh when my sister made a joke, and those who'd stiffen. I knew which relatives would invent excuses for her, and which would, if nudged, say what they'd seen. I called the pediatrician first and asked for advice, not to file a police report yet, just to document the emotional trauma and get a note in my daughter's chart about the incident. The nurse I spoke with was gentle and asked if I wanted a referral for counseling. I said yes, and scheduled an appointment for the following Tuesday at 10 a.m., making sure it was on record that my daughter had been distressed. Then I called my husband at work and told him to come home early and not to make a scene, to be my calm anchor, because whatever I did next had to be surgical, not theatrical. I spent that night writing an unemotional, detailed timeline of everything that had happened that evening. Times, quotes, who was where, because a clear, unemotional ledger is far more damning than a single hysterical accusation. I sent polite, neutral text to a handful of relatives. Please save any photos or videos from last night. I need them for my daughter's records. And I watched who replied and who pretended not to have anything. Meanwhile, I quietly asked my sister for a chat, not to beg or to rage, but to hear what she would say under pressure. She shrugged and laughed. It was a joke, relax, which I recorded, her exact words, because people show their intent with the words they pick. Over the next week, I methodically collected everything that could be used to show intent and outcome. A professional note from the pediatrician documenting my daughter's acute distress, the counselor's intake form noting my daughter's withdrawal and questions about her appearance, the receipts, the screenshots, a recorded voice note where my sister joked about teaching kids tough love and named the cousin who'd helped, and a handful of videos that had been uploaded to a private family chat, awkward clips where you could hear laughter in the background, and on one, the distinct snip of clippers. I didn't post anything publicly. I didn't call her out at Thanksgiving or on social media. I built a small, ironclad case that any reasonable person could look at and see the harm and the deliberate nature of it. Then I started to think about leverage. Not revenge that humiliated my sister in front of the family for the sake of spectacle, but leverage that would cost her something she actually valued: reputation, financial standing, and access to the family narrative she'd always controlled. I researched quietly who handled the neighborhood's private school board and discovered my sister volunteered on that committee. I learned she freelanced for a boutique PR firm whose clients prized discretion. I spoke to a lawyer friend casually at first to ask whether there were grounds for a civil claim for emotional distress on behalf of a minor, enough to make a careful, non-rush case for mediation. The plan began to take shape not as a single dramatic blow, but as a set of consequential moves. Document everything. Ensure my daughter's recovery is supported with professionals on record. Notify institutions where my sister's conduct could be relevant. And prepare a letter detailing the incident and its impact to be delivered if she refused to own up and make amends. I wrote the letter in a calm, exact voice. No accusations without evidence. No melodrama. Outlining what happened, the medical and psychological effects on my child, and the reasonable steps I expected. A public apology to my daughter, paid counseling sessions for her, removal from volunteer positions involving children until she completed sensitivity training, and reimbursement for the clippers and any associated costs. I printed 2 copies, put one in an envelope, and left it unsigned on my kitchen table where my husband would find it and read it over my shoulder, because the smallest theater of domestic optics matters. The other I saved on my phone, dated, and time-stamped. In every conversation I rehearsed, I stayed within the frame of facts. This happened, this is the impact, these are my requests, so that if she lied or minimized, the contrast would be stark. I was no longer the woman who swallowed indignities to keep the peace. I was the mother who would protect her child by any lawful and strategized means necessary, and I felt a cold, steady power in that decision. When I finally delivered the letter, I did it the way she never expected. No raised voice. No family drama, no crowd to feed her smirk. I asked her to meet me at a cafe halfway between our houses, public enough that she couldn't throw a tantrum, quiet enough that I could slide the envelope across the table without anyone else hearing. She ordered a latte, leaning back in her chair with that smug tilt of her chin, already prepared to laugh at me. But when she pulled out the letter and began reading, I watched her posture change. Line by line, the bravado drained. The pediatrician's note, the counselor's intake, the receipt for the clippers, the screenshots, the recordings, the demand for an apology and concrete restitution. Her hands tightened on the paper until it crumpled slightly. "You wouldn't," she said finally, her voice lower, uncertain. I leaned in just enough that she couldn't mistake my calm for weakness. "I already did," I said. "Copies are with my lawyer. If you ignore this, the board at the school gets a packet next week, your firm after that. You've hidden behind family for years. But this isn't about me anymore. It's about my daughter, and you won't touch her again." She sputtered something about me overreacting, but it sounded hollow even to her. She tried to laugh, but it cracked. She wasn't used to consequences. I stood up, left cash for my coffee, and told her she had 1 week to do the right thing. When I walked out of that cafe, sunlight on my face, I realized my legs weren't shaking. For the first time in my life, I had faced her and not flinched. Over the following days, I saw the ripple effect. She didn't show up at my parents' house the way she normally would. She stopped posting mocking jokes in the family chat. A few relatives messaged me privately to say they'd always known she went too far, but never felt they could say anything. One even forwarded me a text from her, panicked, asking if they thought I was serious. And then, finally, a letter arrived at my home addressed to my daughter. It was clumsy, half-hearted, but it contained the words, "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done it." She also included a prepaid receipt for counseling sessions and proof she had resigned from the volunteer committee at the school. It wasn't redemption, not really, but it was evidence that she understood. I wasn't her punching bag anymore, and neither was my child. My daughter read the letter once, and then asked if she could throw it away. I told her she could do whatever she wanted with it. She crumpled it and tossed it into the trash, then looked up at me with a little smile. Her hair was already beginning to grow back, soft fuzz like a crown of resilience, and I brushed my hand over her head gently. "You're still my princess," I whispered, and she nodded. For the first time since that night, her shoulders relaxed. That was when I knew my revenge was complete. Not because my sister had been forced to bend, but because my daughter had seen that her mother would fight for her, with patience, with strategy, with fire disguised as calm. And I promised myself silently, never again would silence be my answer to cruelty. The fallout inside the family was almost more satisfying than my sister's panicked apology because it exposed everything that had been festering for years. My parents tried to downplay it at first, telling me I was making too much of a joke and turning sisters against each other. But the difference this time was that I had evidence and I wasn't afraid to show it. When my father muttered that I was exaggerating, I opened my phone and played the recording of my sister's laughter. Her exact words, "It's just a joke, relax." The room went silent. My mother's face hardened, not with shame, but with the frustration of someone who had lost control of the story she'd been telling for decades, that her eldest daughter was just spirited and fun, while I was uptight and bitter. Suddenly, their narrative didn't hold up anymore. Other relatives began to distance themselves from my sister. My cousin stopped inviting her kids for playdates. An aunt who had always been neutral finally admitted that she'd seen my sister pull cruel stunts before, but had kept quiet to avoid conflict. Even her friends from the school board pulled back, whispering about how unstable she seemed after resigning so abruptly. And the strangest part? My parents didn't rush to defend her the way they used to. I think they saw for the first time that protecting her came at a cost, because it wasn't just me she hurt anymore, it was their granddaughter. And when they saw my daughter's small, bald head and the way she flinched when someone laughed too loudly, even they couldn't pretend it was harmless. My sister hated the shift in power. She tried to spin the story, texting the family group that I was out to ruin her life and using a child as a weapon. But the more she tried, the more desperate she sounded, especially when I didn't rise to her bait. I never argued in the chat, never defended myself. I let her words hang there, unanswered, while the screenshots and the silence told the real story. Over time, the invitations stopped coming her way. She wasn't the star of family gatherings anymore. She was the one people avoided, the one whose chair was suddenly empty at birthdays and anniversaries. It wasn't exile by force. It was exile by consequence. And though part of me still ached for the sister I had once wanted, the bigger part of me felt a deep, quiet relief. Because for the first time, she wasn't standing on my shoulders to make herself taller. For the first time, she had to face her own reflection without my silence cushioning her. My daughter's recovery became the center of my world, because revenge without healing would have been empty. At first, she refused to go to school, terrified the other children would laugh at her bald head, and every morning was a battle of tears and clinging arms. I decided not to force her. Instead, I turned our home into her safe place. We bought bright scarves together, choosing patterns she liked, floral, polka dots, even one with tiny golden stars, and every morning I let her decide how to wear them. Sometimes she wanted a scarf tied like a crown, sometimes a soft beanie pulled low, sometimes nothing at all. I told her she was in control of her image now, and little by little, that power started to sink in. We also went to counseling, and at first she sat curled up in the chair, barely speaking, but the counselor gently coaxed her out with art therapy. She drew herself with long hair again, then slowly started adding crowns, capes, and eventually, her own bald head with a smile. When I saw that drawing, I knew she was finding her way back. The counselor taught her affirmations, and soon I would hear her whispering them to herself in the mirror. I'm strong. I'm pretty. I'm not what they say. At night, I brushed the soft new fuzz on her scalp and told her stories about women who had cut their hair as symbols of strength, of queens and warriors who wore short hair like armor. I wanted her to know this wasn't something stolen from her. It was something she could transform into her own power. The school became part of her healing, too. After I met with the principal and showed the medical notes, the staff quietly watched over her. When a boy made a joke about her head, the teacher immediately shut it down, reminding the class about respect. Slowly, my daughter began to raise her hand again, to play at recess without hiding behind her scarf. The day she walked out of her room without any head covering at all, saying, "I want them to see me," I nearly cried with pride. Her classmates surprised her with kindness. One girl even gave her a bracelet and said, "You're braver than all of us." That night, my daughter told me she wasn't scared anymore. And I realized my revenge hadn't just been about cutting my sister off from her power, it had been about giving my daughter her own. Because every scarf we tied, every appointment we kept, every boundary I enforced against my sister, It all taught my child the one lesson I wish someone had taught me years ago. You don't have to accept cruelty, even if it comes from family. Family is not an excuse. Family is a choice. And we were building ours differently, on safety and respect, not fear and silence. In the end, what stayed with me wasn't my sister's letter or even her silence at family gatherings. It was the look on my daughter's face when she saw her own reflection months later. Hair growing in thick and shiny, her head held high without a scarf. She smiled, not because the hair was back, but because she knew she hadn't been broken. I realized then that revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, measured. Sometimes it's making sure the people who hurt you lose the power they once held, not by screaming at them, but by refusing to carry their weight anymore. My sister still tries to reach out occasionally, but the difference is I don't flinch when her name flashes on my phone. I don't brace myself. I simply don't answer. Because the truth is, she's no longer part of our story. My daughter and I have written a new one where she grows up knowing her worth isn't up for debate, and where I've finally learned that boundaries are the sharpest form of justice. Family may have been the setting for this pain, but it will not be the excuse for it anymore. I protected my child, and in doing so, I finally protected myself.